My name is Abba Kovner. I am known as a fighter of Nazis, a ghetto fighter, and leader of the resistance. Yet, I must admit that I am consumed with guilt. That's because I don't know whether I should be remembered as a fighter of Germans or a betrayer of my mother, who could not escape with me, as I went off to fight with underground. It all started with the concept of resistance, of fighting back. No matter what people may think, we were not passive during our collective nightmare. We did not go to our deaths like sheep to the slaughter. Resistance there was, and it was spearheaded by the Jewish youth movements of Central Europe, which I was part of.
In fact, the map of Europe is dotted with Jewish armed resistance, in ghettos and in camps, from 1941 to 1944. It was a heroic struggle on every level, but just as Jews in the general communities were divided along political lines, from left to right, so were the Jewish youth and youth groups. Just before the war broke out, in the fall of 1939, some 100,000 young Jews were involved in the various youth movements. Despite the fact that the Germans outlawed Jewish youth movements and their activities early on, the movements continued in secret. Some young Jews were doctrinaire communists, some were Trotskyites, some were Zionists, some were members of the Socialist Bund.
As for me, I joined one of the first youth movements in Eastern Europe, HaShomer HaTzair, which combined both Zionism and radical socialism in its ideology. The Dror movement was similar to HaShomer HaTzair, but its members came from poorer circles. The Gordonia movement promoted a more moderate Zionist socialist platform, while the Hanoar HaTzioni and Akiva youth movements encouraged Zionism and Hebrew culture. There was also a right-wing Zionist group called Beitar, named after the last stand of the anti-Roman freedom fighters of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Many of the Zionist movements, except Beitar, were connected to specific kibbutz movements, that is, collective settlements, in Palestine, and were involved in sending members to settle there. Many of us participated in agricultural training programs in preparation for our relocation. We were strongly connected to each other, believing that we were preparing for something of great importance. That was probably why, despite our age, we took a leading role in resisting the Nazis. After Germany invaded Poland, many youth movement leaders fled the cities of Western and Central Poland for Soviet-held Eastern Poland, and still neutral Lithuania and Vilna, where I grew up and went to high school. They hoped to get from there to Palestine, but it wasn't long before some of the youth movements decided to send a number of their senior members back to Nazi-occupied territory. They just wanted to help their fellow young people trapped by the Nazis, and reorganize them as secret, underground organizations. Of course they didn't know and couldn't know about the plan to murder all of them. Among the leaders who returned home in 1940 were Yitzhak, also known as Antek, Zakarman of the Dror HaChalutz movement and Mordechai Anilevich of the HaShomer HaTzair movement. There were others who remained in Lithuania and Vilna, and some managed to flee to the Soviet Union. But many who escaped later suffered, as I did, from survivor's guilt. In general, we were united by two things: a Zionist ideological base and a psychological base. We had to remain together, and the leaders needed to remain with their followers. Over time the only thing left to unite us was a sense of solidarity among those of us who survived. And that gave us a psychological base and support system. The group became our family, which was all the more important since many of our family members had by now disappeared. It was then that the concept of resistance was born. After all, you don't fight the strongest army in Europe unless you know that you're going to be killed anyway. By now we just wanted to register a moral protest. Once we got the big picture regarding the extermination of the Jews of Europe, our resistance stiffened all the more.
And that eventually led to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Each political faction formed its own battle group, which came under the central command of 24-year-old Mordechai Anilevich. The armed resistance prepared for the conflict by building bunkers and shelters. On the 19th of April, 1943, units of the SS and collaborating forces, armed with heavy artillery and tanks, were sent in my Heinrich Himmler. They were ordered to liquidate the ghetto. The resistance fighters numbered only a few hundred and were vastly outnumbered in troop strength and weaponry. But with their small cache of weapons, they were nonetheless able to hold off their enemies for almost a full month. During the fighting, the Germans ravaged the ghetto and all its buildings, block by block, along with the bunkers, where many of the defenders were hiding out. Several hundred Germans died in the course of the uprising, but thousands of Jews were either killed or captured. It took until the 16th of May for the Germans to retake the entire ghetto. To symbolize their victory, they blew up the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, completely destroying a historic landmark. It is estimated that during the uprising, roughly 7,000 Jews lost their lives. Some 50,000 others, who managed to survive, were transported, either to labor camps or death camps. Elsewhere, the youth movements in the ghettos did what they could to boost morale. They organized study courses, seminars, and ideological workshops. They published underground newspapers. And in Warsaw, the youth movements set up a courier network to keep in contact with other ghettos. They even established militias to carry out uprisings within the ghettos. In other ghettos, such as in Kovno, the young resistors made plans to escape to the forests and join the partisans.
In June 1941, Nazi Germany attacked us in Vilna, which was by that time in Lithuanian SSR. They quickly established the Vilna ghetto. I managed to escape with several friends from the Shomer HaTzair youth to a Dominican convent headed by Anna Borkowska in the city's suburbs. The nuns told us what was going on, how the Nazis were killing Jews, and from that information I deduced that the Nazis were determined to kill every last Jew in Europe. It was still difficult for me to explain why Vilna was hemorrhaging blood while Bialystok was calm. One thing was clear to me. Vilna was not just Vilna, Ponary was not just an episode. It was a whole system. There wasn't anything particularly logical about it, but it was true. And I had figured it out. I returned to the ghetto. I concluded that in order for any revolt to succeed, a Jewish fighting force was needed. I made a public announcement at a meeting of delegates of all Jewish youth movements. Hitler is plotting to destroy all European Jews. Lithuanians Jews will be the first in line. Let us not be led like sheep to the slaughterhouse. It is right, we are weak and without defense, but the only answer to the enemy's resistance. And so I decided to form an underground. We often used girls as couriers, because they would not be suspected. In January 1942, the United Organization of Partisans was founded in Vilna. All the parties and youth movements, from the whole political spectrum in the ghetto, took part. I was a member of the headquarters, but after our chief commander, Itzhak Wittenberg, was captured, I became the head of the organization. My nickname was Uri. In the days of the last deportation from the ghetto to the death camps, I supervised the escape of our fighters to the woods. In the Rodniki woods I commanded the Jewish unit, which was composed of ghetto fighters and the Nakam squadron from the Jewish camp. We seized guns from dead Soviet soldiers. Of course many of us were killed in the process. But we did what we had to do, and there was no turning back.
Unbeknownst to them, there was a completely parallel, yet isolated resistance movement forming in Western Europe. In May 1942, there was a meeting in southern France of a number of leaders of the underground Zionist movement. They decided to form an organized resistance. By then, they knew about the fascist German plan of genocide, and they aimed to hide as many Jews as possible, especially children, or perhaps get them across the border to Spain. Many of them had roots in the Communist Party of France and also in the Movement of Organizations of Immigrants, or MOI. But the core of the movement was Jewish. They heroically fought the Germans and they suffered serious casualties. But they also managed to save between 7,000 and 9,000 children in occupied France. Interestingly enough, none of them were betrayed by the French. Back in Hungary, the Zionist movement wasn't large. They also recognized that the wisest course was not to resist with arms, since combating the power of the German army was useless. Zionist youth groups supplied food to ghettos, stole money, appeared in fascist militia uniforms, and engaged in many daring exploits, including the rescue of many Jewish children. They also created thousands of false identification papers for Jews. Their story dovetails with celebrated Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who was stationed in Budapest. While serving as Sweden's special envoy in 1944, he issued protective passports and sheltered Jews in safe houses, which were designated as Swedish territory, saving tens of thousands of lives. On January 17, 1945, during the siege of Budapest by the Red Army, Wallenberg was detained by Soviet authorities on suspicion of espionage and subsequently disappeared. He was later reported to have died in July 1947 while imprisoned by communist authorities and KGB secret police.
But as I said, I was subsequently consumed with guilt, since in order to fight with the underground, I had to abandon my own mother. When it was all over, I addressed the Jewish Brigade in Italy, in 1945. But what are we to do in our sick souls? We bear not only the vision of the past, but also that of the future. And we feel with all our senses the breath of the approaching slaughtering knife. The knife which lies in ambush in every corner, on every path and highway of Europe. The new knife was born on the fields of Majdanek, Ponar, and Treblinka, where millions of the masses of tens of nations saw how it was done. So easily, so simply, and so quietly.